Most importantly for today's conversation, he's the chair of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. Before I turn it over to Dr. Schmidt, please note that after his remarks, we'll shift to audience Q&A. You can enter questions and vote for your favorites from others by clicking on the blue and white chat icon in the bottom right of your screen and going to the Q&A tab. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Schmidt.
Well, thank you, Justin. Thank you for all the work you've done for our commission. I'm incredibly grateful to the NDIA for putting this expo together. We had talked about trying to popularize some of these ideas, and NDIA is a natural sponsor for this. I also wanted to thank General Carlisle, who has worked really, really hard with us to make this and a number of other activities possible. What I want to do is I want to talk about the future of AI, the competition with China for emerging technologies, and the key technology platforms that are critical for the United States and for essentially for our winning or staying ahead and being prosperous with great national security over the next decade. I have a relatively straightforward argument. When it comes to emerging technologies, we're in a competition with China, and AI is at the center of that contest. And I actually believe this. So we need to preserve national competitiveness, and we need to focus on leading the way on fundamental technologies that will have broad impacts on our economy and our society and our security. You see this in many examples today, which I'll go through. We must continue to press forward urgently and collaboratively across government, industry, and academia. By the way, we all have to work together as a group to make these key platforms that will define national security and economic prosperity. Everybody in this audience, everybody who's going to talk today, is part of that effort or should be. So our report has lots and lots of recommendations in the area, and I would encourage you, and let me just ask you personally, take a look at our recommendations, which were arrived after a great deal of work with the government. We had enormous access and help from everybody throughout the federal government. We really mean it. It's really important for our nation. So let me talk first about AI and some of its more promising applications. I define AI as the ability for machines to do human-like tasks. AI has rapidly become a part of our daily lives. You use it every day when you use Translate and things like this. But it's really expanding applications in industry, science, defense, and other fields. And computer scientists and engineers have applied AI to develop technologies capable of driving insights and innovations that have eluded humans forever, right? It's a real stepping stone to something new. So the advent of AI, powered by the advances in computing processing power and increasingly ubiquitous computers, promises to produce a revolution in our human activities and our human affairs. It's a nascent revolution, but people like myself feel it. We can see it. We can see that the progress is inevitable. There's so much effort in this throughout our nation, in fact, across the globe. So the promise of AI and machine learning has been demonstrated, and computing power needed to achieve this sophisticated processes is becoming widely available. And very few fields will not be affected. I think pretty much everything's going to be affected by it. So let me give you some examples. In science, with AI as a research partner, the pace of discovery in the physical sciences, life sciences, and social sciences is accelerating. Machine learning is already enabling estimation and modeling that defied conventional scientific approaches. For example, researchers at MIT, and I work pretty closely with them, have developed a neural network capable of screening more than 100 million chemical compounds in a matter of days to identify potential antibiotics. The algorithm learns to predict molecular function without any assumptions about how the drugs work and without labeling chemical groups, allowing it to learn new patterns unknown to human experts. The results speak for themselves. Last year, this team from MIT announced the discovery of a new antibiotic called halicine, which is one that has never been contemplated among humans, and yet it shows promising results in a category of infections. And it's been a long time since we've had a new antibiotic. It's showing promise against a range of bacteria, including some strains that were previously untreatable, whose names I can't remember because they were so long. But the success of halicine really represents an entirely new pathway of how to do this. What they did is they had the computer look for things which looked like they had an antibiotic treatment, but also were things which had never been considered before. And they did this huge search using these powerful algorithms. It looks like it worked. So anyway, this will produce these extraordinary scientific advances that I was describing. And what you're seeing is you're seeing breakthroughs that would have taken 10 or 20 years will occur in 6 months or a year. That's the accelerant that's occurring because of AI. And the implications at the civilian and military level of this kind of stuff is pretty profound. And we're just beginning to see it. Give you another example about translation. I used to think that computers would never be able to translate anything. Of course, I was completely wrong. And we've developed AI systems with roughly the translation capability of a bilingual speaker. They still make mistakes, but they're quite good, and they're obviously fast, and they're much cheaper. And while they're not the same as a professional translator, they more than suffice for the simple tasks. So this vision that we've had of a world where people could communicate with each other appears to be in our grasp. This has to be good. This has to be good for national security and for the world as a whole. Now, we don't know exactly when will AI be better than the best human translators, but it's on its way. It may never get there, but it may actually get there. It will certainly occur at some point. Universal translation of spoken language and text, these things will talk to each other. And all of a sudden, you can already do things where somebody speaks in one language and it comes out in another. Now, not only, this has a lot of implications, because once we're all connected, it also means that we're going to hear things like misinformation, polarization, and hate speech. And the AI systems, and I'll return to this later, they have to represent our values. They can't be the bad kid on the block. They can't be full of hate speech and so forth. We have to work on that. The important thing is we're beginning to explore the answers to these now. Another example is automation. Automated devices run by AI, you're all familiar with Alexa, Siri, the Google Assistant. They're already commonplace. But robotics and the manipulation of physical objects lags behind computing, but there's a lot of effort in that area. Vehicles, tools, and appliances will increasingly use AIs that automate their activity under our direction and supervision. You heard a lot in our session here from companies that have been doing that. And this is going to be a large business opportunity, but also something which really helps people around. Flight, another example, something I care a lot about. AI will pilot or co-pilot vehicles in the air, not just in the ground or in the water. There was a DARPA-run project called Alpha Dogfight, where AI fighter pilots were defeating humans in simulated air combat. Now, that's obviously a demo, but the point is it's an example. It shows the way of how this stuff is going to work. DARPA has already sort of talked about this. It's really impressive. And what I now understand, this was also true in this U2 demo that was done late last year, the tools and the techniques, the software is readily available to build this. It's not rocket science, excuse the pun, anymore. I am really focused, and I think we should all focus on tech platform competition. This principle of platforms will ultimately leverage the dimensions of national power, from healthcare to food production to environmental sustainability. The adoption of AI in these fields will drive economics, shape societies, and determine which states exert influence and exercise power in the world. But these AI-enabled global platforms barely existed a decade ago. Think about how different the world is 10 years from now, 10 years ago versus now, and then imagine what it will be like in 10 years. There are very few existing intellectual concepts, regulation, foreign policy norms for their development and use. AI operating across global platforms may know and shape human activity in ways that we collectively don't understand, and no individual human or government ever has. Who will determine the objectives, designs, and regulatory parameters for AI? Question. Now, many countries have national AI strategy, and I think that's great. With the explosion of research, development, and commercialization of AI development is global. But progress in AI has largely been concentrated in the United States and China, and to a lesser degree, Europe. Only the United States and China have the resources, the commercial might, the talent pool, and the innovation ecosystem to lead the world in AI. In some areas of research, and you'll read this at great length in our report, China is an AI peer, and it's already more technically advanced in certain applications, which may shock some of the Americans in our audience. But we need to take this very seriously. within the next decade, China could surpass the United States as the world's AI superpower. And indeed, they have set this as an objective, and they've done so publicly. I want to say clearly to all of you that maintaining and extending US global leadership in technology is both an economic and national security imperative. Innovation is the foundation of our economy and is the source of our military advantage. I mean, come on, look at all the things we've done to get where we are. Leadership gives our government and military access to the most advanced available technologies. It puts us in the best position to secure them against vulnerabilities. And it enables us to set standards for their responsible use, which is critically important. I am convinced that the threat of Chinese leadership in key technology areas is a national crisis. Now, there's lots of national crises, but this is one that you can see developing. And it's one of those things where if you act now, you'll have a much better outcome than if you wait a while. And the president exactly said this in his speech in Munich. The United States is in a long-term strategic competition with China. So China is pursuing technology leadership through strategic investments in a wide range of technology areas, including the Made in China 2025 initiative. You can read all about this on the web. In addition to AI, China is seeking to lead the world in quantum computing, 5G networks, synthetic biotechnology. These are at the crux of the innovation engine of the United States, among other areas, of course. Beijing sees national strategies in these areas as mutually reinforcing. You do well in one, you do well in the other, they improve each other. And the CCP has made it clear which technologies it uses national priorities. Each of these areas, China is pushing to meet or beat our work. That's the important thing. So they're telling us what they're doing. What is our response? So now if China takes the lead, the first mover advantages in developing and deploying new technologies will make it difficult for the United States to catch up. In critical sectors with strong network effects like telecommunications, a winner-take-all dynamic raises the stakes for rapidly developing leading technology platforms. It shouldn't surprise people in the audience that many of the platforms that emerge end up with 80 or 90% market share, at least initially, because people adopted them because of the network effects that drive them. We, the United States, need to develop a unified strategy to advance and protect the technologies that will underpin national competitiveness in the middle decades of the 21st century, even as we continue to cooperate we have to cooperate with competitors like China in areas of mutual interest. So we have to compete, and we also have to cooperate in the right places. So a couple of other things I would say. I think the White House needs an integrated approach to federal investments and policies across a wide range of emerging technologies to compete with China or be left behind. A comprehensive national strategy would set and reinforce priorities and reconcile budget trade-offs. The strategy should be led by the White House. I strongly support the AI Commission's recommendation to establish a White House-led Technology Competitiveness Council that would be chaired by the Vice President and overseen by senior White House coordinator to ensure the President has the organizational structure in place to develop, drive, and fund a real national technology strategy. I cannot say enough that we need such a strategy, right? When we work collectively as a country, we're incredibly powerful. And if we're disorganized, we lose time and we miss opportunities. So this national strategy should focus on fundamental technologies with broad impact on national competitiveness and security. A priority shortlist would include, again, what's the list? AI, 5G, microelectronics, biotechnology, quantum computing, and I'll come back to those because I feel strongly about them. The shortlist should also include, in my opinion, advanced production, which includes manufacturing, agriculture, and assembly, as well as infrastructure augmented by machine intelligence. This is roads and bridges and pipelines to electrical networks. I, for one, am tired of being trapped in these old technology systems which the infrastructure can't get upgraded to. I understand the power of how these software and AI networks could make our lives more prosperous, more successful, and so forth. So anyway, the important point about this advanced production is that we need it to enable the goals in the face of supply chain shocks, natural disasters, epidemics, and so forth. It can also prevent leapfrogging through greater efficiencies, and energy optimization while reducing decaying stockpiles of goods. The capacity to produce high-tech goods domestically is critical to national security, both to maintain access to finished goods and as a driver of innovation. The United States must strive for self-reliance in these industries. Think of this as a resilience theory. In the areas at least that are critical for national security, but frankly, I think a lot is now part of our economics, and we need to be resilient in those spaces. So this new infrastructure is essential to handle emergencies. Think about the frozen gas supplies in Texas. What a terrible thing to go through. Or the wildfires in California that have been so difficult. And they also need to permit trade-offs between different modalities, trains versus trucks and pipelines, and reduce the environmental impact and cost of ownership. U.S. physical infrastructure remains largely disconnected. No U.S. cities are ranked in the top 10 in smart city connectedness. Only one is in the top 30. Maximizing citizens' access to the digital economy. And another activity is important. Another activity I've been involved with, separate from this, we came back and said, the infrastructure of connectivity is the highest priority to make things better in the United States, because you just can't operate without a powerful computing and connected infrastructure today. I think we need to call for a more assertive government role. The U.S. is capable of out-innovating any competitor. That's not in question here. But there's a fundamental approach difference between the United States and China. And I frankly think that it puts American leadership in peril. Our innovation model, of course, has been the envy of the world, and the open exchange of ideas and free markets and so forth, which all of us believe in, has been the key to my personal success. I'm very, very grateful for this. The government involvement and target support for basic research is why we're here today and why I'm here today. The pillars of American way of innovation and reflect American values. Tech firms compete for market share. They are not instruments of state power in America. And the technology advances in the United States will be driven by the private sectors in innovation and in universities. That's how our model works. The government doesn't typically lead. What typically leads is the private sector and universities, and the government sort of follows along. I don't want to lose this innovation culture that is bottoms up and that is infused with a garage startup mentality. Basically, the largest companies in the United States, S&P, are today all started with that as a premise. Keeping things exactly the same, however, is not going to work. It's not going to be a winning strategy, because large tech firms cannot be expected to compete with the resources of China or make a big nationwide investment in the United States to need to stay ahead. We need some help. We need a hybrid approach that more aligns government and industry and the private sector to win. The private sector, I obviously have a bias here, is America's greatest strength. Companies move faster and more globally than any government could. But the changing landscape, the government must take a hands-on approach to national technology competitiveness. Promoting a diverse and resilient research and development ecosystem and commercial sector is a government responsibility. No private sector company, no matter how successful and powerful, can really pull that off. We need expanding talent pipelines, more quickly reforming immigration and visa authorities like the H-1B visas to attract the world best, and improving our educational system are all public policy choices. Protecting intellectual property and thwarting the systematic campaign of illicit knowledge transfer being conducted by competitors is a government obligation. And I learned a long time ago that private sector companies can't do that. It has to be done by the government. Protecting hardware advantages and building resiliency in supply chains necessitates legislation and federal incentives. Bringing together like-minded allies and partners requires US-led diplomacy. Our report, which again you all have, recommends that the US government should explicitly identify the technology platforms that are essential to overall technology leadership and find ways to bolster US progress in those sectors. Leading in these platforms may require government action for several reasons. In some instances, a market failure, possible, could lead to an underinvestment by the private sector in an area. In other areas, seizing a market opportunity may only be possible if the federal government does a focusing effort where it focuses the private sector and academia and research organizations on a specific goal. The government should tailor its approach to the context by increasing funding, because money speaks, implementing regulatory changes to make sure it actually occurs, and we're taking other steps that are consistent with promoting innovation and protecting these advantages to fit the circumstances. So for example, the AI Commission, and you can read the details, recommends establishing a national AI research resource. Lots of people are envious that the big companies have these very, very powerful networks. We need access to those kinds of networks by startups, and most importantly, the academic research community, who needs this kind of computing power in order to basically extend US leadership. The same principle needs to be thought through in other key areas: 5G, microelectronics, quantum, and bio. And I'll discuss some of those in just a sec. A lot has been said about 5G. Promoting the rapid build out of 5G network infrastructure is a national security imperative. I worked pretty hard on this. It's pretty controversial, but the fact of the matter is future military preparedness will rely on it, and fostering technology competitive US companies' sizes depends on it, right? We are in the process of losing that battle. I say, based on my analysis, which you can debate, that China is at roughly 10 times faster, or 10 times ahead, if you will, of the United States on 5G for reasons which I can describe. We should reinvest spectrum auction proceeds into the network infrastructure. The government just raised on the order of $90 billion out of the telcos to do the C-band auction. That money should go right back in some way, to make sure that that 5G infrastructure gets built out for the benefit of all of us and our companies and our nation. There are lots and lots of other things. Explore spectrum sharing and other auction alternatives, and modify the auction terms to ensure network infrastructure actually gets built, right? We want these networks, we need it, we're behind. In microelectronics, crucial to AI, we concluded after lots of discussion, although it's difficult to see how to maintain an advantage in software because it's so porous, we see a way to a strategy to stay at least 2 generations ahead of China in state-of-the-art microelectronics and direct funding. So basically, we should commit to maintain multiple sources of cutting-edge microelectronics fabrication in the United States. I would recommend at least 3 things. The executive branch should finalize and implement a national microelectronics leadership strategy. This thing, by the way, is really hard. People have worked on this for 30 years. It has to have the right people with the right trade-offs. Congress should offer, I'll give you an example, a 40% refundable tax credit and grants for domestic fabrication investments by firms from the United States and allies. It's not going to happen without some kind of federal guaranteed loan or help to the private sector. The numbers are too big. And I also think that the Congress should appropriate an additional $12 billion over the next 5 years for microelectronics research, development, and infrastructure in key areas. One of the ones that's most interesting is advanced packaging. These investments would really help the ideas of the transition of ideas from university prototypes to commercial scale production domestically. I cannot emphasize how microelectronics leadership got us to where we are today, and I want to stay ahead. It's crucial for national security. It's also crucial for our business success. Quantum. After we issued our report, there was evidence provided that China has accelerated its investment in quantum computing. They clearly understand the value of quantum, and they're clearly investing in it. America has done a great deal of the leadership in that area. It's time for us to double down again and invest it even more. We're clearly a global leader in research today, but we're now in the process of risking our lead in applications for it, for national security and others. We should avoid the situation with quantum materials, which we now face with microelectronics, where we rely on a foreign country to make them. So these things need to be designed in the United States, and I think we can pull that off, but they need to be manufactured. The current technology, by the way, is basically done at 0 Kelvin, so it's quite a project. This is a huge point. I think that one of the things that you could imagine is this national AI research resource, which is sort of this network for computation for universities and small companies and so forth, could include that kind of quantum computing. It's clearly going to occur. Think of the breakthrough that would imply. Let me mention biotechnology, another one where there have been huge breakthroughs. I mentioned halocene before. We believe that the advanced domestic R&D network of funding biodata and biomanufacturing initiatives is key. Federal R&D agencies should fund and prioritize efforts to build a world-class biobank containing a wide range of high-quality biological and genetic data sets, securely accessible, and security is important by researchers. On the manufacturing side, expanding access to advanced biofabrication tools among startups and laboratories would avoid some of the overlap that occurs today, but allows them to put things in the cloud. So think of it as a cloud-based resource to build the next interesting generation of biology. This is an area of enormous innovation. Trillion-dollar companies will be created in this, and it's obviously important for reasons that you can imagine for national security. There are other examples I didn't go into. Autonomy and robotics, advanced manufacturing, a very big deal for America. And energy systems, huge deal for America, and storage are all critical, and these are in this competitive framework. I want to take a minute and talk about the implications of this stuff for national defense. I've shown my own bias by talking about the commercial uses, and the commercial sector and the military sector will work hand in hand to move these technologies forward. These emerging technologies are creating, I'm just going to call them whole of society threats. The easiest way for me to express this is that national security beyond the traditional battlefield will change because AI-enabled capabilities will become the tools of first resort, not last resort. Today, when the military thinks of these things, they think of it as, oh yeah, it's over there and so forth. But I think it's pretty evident that AI will be the first part of any kind of national security challenge, defense, offense, and so forth and so on. And state and non-state actors determined to challenge the United States, but will try to avoid direct military confrontation, will use AI to amplify existing tools and develop new ones. Adversaries are exploiting our digital openness through AI-accelerated information operations and cyber attacks. This is well publicized. People are aware of this. If you think about ad tech will become national security tech, as adversaries recognize that advertising and technology firms have recognized for years that machine learning is a powerful tool for harvesting and analyzing data. The same techniques that the big tech companies use can also be used by our adversaries to get the same kind of advantage in targeting that we're not going to want this applied to us as citizens. So using espionage and publicly available data, adversaries will gather information and use AI to identify vulnerabilities in our individuals, our society, and critical infrastructure, which is obviously incredibly important. Now, if you do the same thing on the military side, the technology areas have important and wide-ranging defense applications. The sources of battlefield advantage, which is sort of part of our military doctrine, will shift from traditional factors like force size and level of armaments, which we can sort of count, if you will, how many tanks, how many troops, and so forth and so on, to factors like superior data collection and assimilation, connectivity, computing power, algorithms, and system security. Defending against AI-capable adversaries without employing AI is an invitation to disaster. AI will compress decision timeframes from minutes to seconds, expand the scale of attacks, and demand responses that will tax the limits of human cognition. Human operators will not be able to defend against an AI-enabled cyber or disinformation attacks, drone swarms, or missile attacks without the assistance of AI-enabled machines. The best human operator cannot defend against multiple machines making thousands of maneuvers per second, potentially moving at hypersonic speeds and orchestrated by AI across domains. Humans cannot be everywhere at once, but software can. And the Pentagon has sort of been dealing with this. It's not a surprise to them. I'm concerned that the department's current pace of technology integration, I don't think that the military will be capable of carrying them out in time. To fight as the military intends to fight in 2030 or 2035, the department is going to need to get fundamentals in place for well before then. I and others have been working on this with them. They're receptive to this idea. It takes focus and money to do so. I also would say that the DoD needs to revise the way it builds things. Silicon Valley has shown an iterative way to form smart teams, drive hard deliverables, and move quickly. I can go on about this forever. The government does not allow any of that. The procurement is separate from design and design feedback, which is crazy. Software is an afterthought, like it's fundamental in my world. And the big systems are so siloed that they can't be integrated together. Literally, you can't talk because no one ever thought that they would be anything other than their own little system. But they need to work together now. We should build missiles now the way we build cars. Use a design studio to develop and simulate in return. Return to the skunkworks model. People in the military talk a lot about the golden age of the skunkworks that Lockheed did in the 1960s and 70s. It's not like we don't know how to do that. We've just chosen not to do it. Let's go back to it. These new design studio ideas and digital twinning approaches will allow this, and you have to alter or put in some exceptions for procurement to allow this fast iteration. At least, and what I would recommend, since it's probably a big change for the system, is the DoD should pick a couple programs that are strategic and do it that way. We talk in our report a number of specific recommendations for how the DoD could do this. I know I've been going on for a while, and I'm sorry I get too excited about this, but let me just say, it's been a great privilege for me as an American to be part of the leading edge of American technology industry for, I think, 35 or 40 years now. That work began for me with grants from the federal government. My graduate work was funded by the National Science Foundation and DARPA. These and other investments that I was the beneficiary of, and I'm very, very grateful to them, led to a renaissance of technology that made America and our technology sector the envy of the world, and our military the most capable fighting force in our history. But right now, again, I don't know how to say it any more directly, the United States is not playing to win. The Chinese, who are competing to become the world's leading innovators, they have a plan, they're focused on it, they have a different system. Never before in my lifetime have I been more worried that we will soon be displaced by a rival, and that we don't like being in second place in these technology battles. It's a really uncomfortable position. In the private sector, I've been in that. It's difficult. I don't want America to end up in that situation. It's bad for our economy, bad for social security, bad for the future of our nation. Let me finish by saying we need a bold, bipartisan initiative that extends our nation's technology advantage, but we must do so now. Success matters far more than our company's bottom lines and our military's battlefield edge. Because our technology and that of our closest allies and partners embodies our values, advancing individual liberty and strengthening free societies are also on the line. So it's not just business, it's not just technology, it's not just platform, it's also values, what we believe in as a country, our national heritage, all the things that we talk about. The speakers you've heard from over the last few days, and you, the members of this audience, you have a power. You have the power to chart a new path for technology leadership. By working together to implement these recommendations, which we work so hard on, we can lay the foundations for leadership in the AI and the full range of emerging technologies that underpin our future prosperity and security. I think that the Commission's report offers the blueprints for action in this event as gathered the key players together. We must now commit individually and collectively. I need you collectively with me to work together to win this technology competition. It is the future of our American discourse. I look forward to your questions. Thank you for listening to me. I care a lot about this. It's a great privilege to be here. Thank you, and thank you all. Thank you, Justin.
Right. Dr. Schmidt, thank you for your remarks, especially your sense of urgency and call for action. That's something that we urgently need right now. So we'll move into the audience Q&A part of this now. So for the first, or as a quick reminder for the audience, you can enter questions and vote for your favorites from others by clicking on the blue and white chat icon in the bottom right of your screen and going into the Q&A tab. So to start from the audience Q&A, when venture capital funds innovation, then the large majority or even only innovation that happens is innovation that fits that venture capital model. How is the U.S. going to realistically compete with China when China is pushing so much innovation at the government level?
I would say that I actually like the American system, and I think we should respect the fact that the Chinese system is different and it's also working well. So the Chinese system has brutal domestic competition, and then they pick a winner and then they fund the heck out of it. That's not how America works. The venture model with enough venture capital does cover all the key areas as long as there are not infrastructure barriers. So I think we can achieve the goals we've set out with the existing venture model, so long as there are critical infrastructures that are helped create, there's government funding around it, and barriers. An example in 5G is that there's a spectrum problem, which is not something that the private sector can solve. The private sector cannot solve the immigration problem. So the way I would say it is, I think, to answer the question precisely, I think we'll be fine with the venture model so long as we go back to having a whole government sort of strategy to try to get everybody more in the same directions. And I'm not suggesting large government programs, top-down management. I don't think that will work in America. It seems to be working in China, different country, different culture.
That's so helpful, almost like the government's enabling the system rather than just trying to invest and replicate the Chinese model.
It's hard to find where the barrier is. And there are plenty of examples where the federal government sort of got too far ahead of the private sector or started to regulate it ahead of time. So the key thing, it starts with agreeing on what the priorities are, which I think I've outlined. And I've talked to lots of other people since I've been working on this, and kind of all of the other independent groups are coming to the same list. So let me confidently say that if we got all the people who are thinking about this together in one room or a Zoom or something, we would agree that the list is AI, 5G, robotics, synthetic bio, energy, transportation, the list that I already discussed. And that's the list is in our report, Justin. So I think there's agreement on the list. Then what we need to do is for each of them have a strategy. I think and I'm not to overwhelm this, but I think the semiconductor one is the hardest because semiconductors are crucial and these plants are incredibly expensive.
Absolutely. So you mentioned, and this question, is from David Simon from Northrop Grumman. You mentioned multiple actions necessary for the government to enact a national strategy for AI superiority. In your opinion, what's the most important action that contractors, either the big defense contractors or commercial contractors, smaller firms, can take to align with that strategy and ensure national success?
So let me answer the question generically about how the contractors work. And these are people working very hard to help our government and so forth. The government tends to tell them what to do, and because they're co-dependent on each other, they do what the government says. And what I would ask the contractor to do is, in addition to the things that they're currently doing, I'd like every one of them to have a powerful AI research group that shows what they in the private sector could do if a contract were given them by the government. So I think the way this will work is the government is not going to say, build me the world's most powerful AI system to do X. I think the way it works is that the contractors will show that path and the government will say, oh my God, here's somebody who's figured it out and they can do it in our context and we know how to buy from them. I think it's well established that a lot of the venture-funded small companies want to do this, but they don't have the economic structure, the regulatory structure, and the experience working with the federal government. So I would say that the large contractors and mid-sized contractors are going to be key for this transition. They're really, really important, but they have to act now ahead of the procurement that's going to be coming.
A question from Shane Shaneman as well. With the great power competition that we are now in with AI, how should we invest and collaborate with our international Five Eye partners to accelerate AI research and capability development? And what are the existing or new programs or initiatives that we should leverage?
So in our report, we talk at some length about there being a technology strategy group and an assistant secretary and so forth in the State Department to essentially corral our democratic allies, people with the same values, if you will, and try to get alignment. I think one of the things that our AI Commission has agreed to do is talk to other countries as well who are sort of compatible with our vision. And it's an interesting list to figure out who should be on that list. There's already a list in Asia called the Quad, which people are interested in. It involves Japan, Australia, and India. There are proposals around groups which are called the T10 and T12, which include Asian partners, but also very important key European partners, and often using Israel. The Five Eyes are always the first starting point for that conversation. But all of these are examples where the government needs some kind of a group that doesn't command but coordinates the activities. So helps people find each other and make sure that everyone's talking to each other. I betcha that if you looked at the national security strategies for the countries we're talking about, and the issues around information access, AI, misinformation, the kind of cyber attacks, there would be complete agreement on what the sum of those countries should do.
That makes perfect sense. So this is coming from David San Clemente. You mentioned the lethargy of the federal government, its tendency to lack real focus earlier, and certainly the changing list of top priorities inside the Department of Defense for R&E can contribute to that. But given this reality, how do you recommend people that are on the outside of government, industry, academia, can create the influence necessary to achieve the needed actions?
Well, when the government decides to focus, I think it does a pretty good job. Secretary Mattis put together a national security, national defense strategy, which I was a small participant in back when I was doing the DIB work. And I thought it was really good. It was very clear. It was understandable. It helped people organize. We need analogous documents along those lines. So we need a national strategy around microelectronics. We need a national strategy around quantum. And this doesn't define the products. This says, what are we trying to achieve? And where are the leverage points? Where are the areas of greatest strength? And so using semiconductors, what's the narrative about what happens in the next fab, right? I don't want to build the last fab. I want to build the next one. And I want that narrative to be correct. So I go back to the fact that the government is so big, there's so much money, there's so many players. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars, and people are trying to do the best thing they can. They often don't have coherent direction, right? So they're busy working the best way they can with the resources they have, but they don't see where they are in this larger position. The DOD did a good job by creating what is called the JAIC, which is a Joint AI Center. And the JAIC has served as a focusing point around some of the military activities. I won't go into the details, but in the report, we suggest that the JAIC needs to be headed by a certain level of person in the management hierarchy, and there needs to be a coordinating committee around the AI activities in order to provide that at the military level.
So as a follow-on question to that, it seems like some of this is organizational, but there's also a human capital component of what you're describing. How much would you break apart in terms of this is an organizational structure and acquisition authorities and regulations piece versus actually making sure we recruit, select, and promote people who understand that type of technology?
One of the problems with this stuff is it's really, really hard to understand. The top researchers have PhDs in physics and math. They're impossibly intelligent and they're impossibly valuable to our nation because of what they're doing. But most of us are not able to operate at that level, nor do we frankly wish to. So we have to find a way to get those people into our government in some form. Our report proposes a couple of ideas to try to increase the technical capability. One is essentially a 4-year civilian college, which would give a technical degree in return for working for the federal government in any capacity that's interesting. For the subsequent 5 years. We think that that's a strong, there's lots of bipartisan support for that one. There's another one which is built around the reserve notion that you would sign up for the reserve and you might spend up to 30 days is the conventional wisdom, working in addition to your normal job, working with the government to help them advance. We've got to find, those two are good ideas. We talk about them. There are a number of others in the report. We've got to find ways to get these specialists into the government. I cannot tell you how, when I was doing my military work, how many very nice people I met with who were dealing with very complicated technical challenges that did not have technical degrees. And so they were relying on advisors. The advisors might be high quality or low quality. They couldn't really tell. We need people who have that kind of technical ability in the government and in positions of power, at least at the design level. So they have good judgment as go this way versus that way. Our report, something like a quarter to a third of our recommendations of our report are essentially in the talent area. And by the way, this is not just the DOD. Everyone wants to focus on the DOD. Think about the intelligence communities, how they would benefit. by having these incredibly powerful vision systems to look for the things that they're looking for. They don't have enough of that talent. They're good. They need to be better. We need to help them. The rest of the government is even in worse shape. Think about the Commerce Department and the IRS and the fisheries. And all of those things would benefit from the kind of facilities and analytical capabilities that AI would provide just to do their jobs better.
Yeah, that's really striking, especially when you get into areas like commerce, where they're helping actually build regulations and having the background knowledge for that. Continuing with a couple other audience questions. Can the government work with venture capital to fund more risky side innovations, such as quantum robotics and other areas where VCs are reluctant to invest? And I'll add to that, not just risky areas, but things that require much more long-term investments because of the nature of the research.
Yeah, I think there's a line, and I'll editorialize by saying nobody wants to go through the Solyndra situation from 10 years ago. So the line goes something like this. You don't want the government to crowd out the private investor. You want them to help the private investor, but you want the risk and the incentives to be in alignment. So in our report, we talk about promoting research and promoting infrastructure that's helpful to everyone. I don't think, so there's a line, and I think you want to do these in such a way that you're not actually putting the money in. You want the venture capitalists to raise the money. Maybe you make it cheaper for them or something, but you want the model that has gotten us to today in America to continue to work.
And this next question's straightforward in asking and deeply complicated in the answer, but we'll go ahead and ask it anyway. But why is the government itself slow to adopt AI? It's named as a national priority. It's named as a defense priority. But very few defense agencies have prioritized AI investment for their own agency. What do you think the root causes are of that?
Again, I'll editorialize by saying that, and this is my own opinion. So I spent 5 years working for the DOD with the Innovation Board, and I really like the people. I think they're fantastic people. They're courageous. They're smart. I really enjoyed them. But they're trapped in a 1980s, 1990s system of big things that take a long time, that cost a lot of money. And the innovation industry has moved forward. In my prepared remarks, I mentioned at some level the design studio, the rapid and agile development. And what's happened is people can speak those words, but they haven't made the changes. A simple example is that in the military today, there's something called the POM process, where you basically, and you know this, Justice, from your work, you basically make a request and then it gets approved 2 years from now. Now, no business would be in business if that was the way it operated. So, and those make sense if what you're doing, you're building very large things that take a very long time that are unique, but innovation has changed. And that's why the military has to change its approach as well.
So you mentioned several applications of AI that might fulfill roles that humans have traditionally performed, and not necessarily lead to job loss, but certainly change the way humans are working. So how should companies shape who they hire and how they train their workforce, especially to maximize their competitive advantage, and then also for the government to do that as well?
Well, there's a lot of work now going on what does the workforce look like in the future? I've personally, unrelated to the AI Commission, funded activities in these areas. And the consensus of the people that I've spoken with is that there will be lots of jobs in the future, but that the jobs that will be meaningful will be the information economy jobs, which typically require a technical education, an analytical background, or a college degree. And there's this sort of fundamental question of what do you do with the people who just don't want to do that or don't care for it or what have you. And it seems to me that we should change our hiring processes so that you get people into the government with somewhat more technical familiarity. I'm not talking about programmers and so forth. I'm just saying people who are more technical in their approach. They're either more engineers or you can use data science or things like this. And as a national priority, and this is not a new point, we need to emphasize those who are capable of doing STEM subjects should do it, because the crises, if you will, that I'm talking about are all STEM related. And I think that there is a lot of hope that these AI systems will help everyone to be smarter, right? They're not just for the elites or the physicists or whatever, they're for everyone. And so I'm very hopeful that when we get this sort of model right, that the fact that these AI systems will help everyone get through the day, not just one group or another, will in fact make people, from their perspective, smarter. And also with that kind of capability, working hand in hand between people and computers tends to produce higher wages.
So there's a lot of possibilities that have come up in the conversation today and over the last few days as well. But based off of cost or the size of models, the amount of compute required, what do you see as the limits of what we can do with machine learning, either because of those constraints or because of an actual ceiling on the accuracy or sophistication of outputs? And how do you think that'll affect industry over the next 10 years? And how should that guide our research and development?
So where we are today is we're reliant on models that have errors in them, and they typically cannot explain how they got to where they were. I'm not saying anything people don't already know. This is the primary area of research going forward to try to address these. So if you were to freeze everything in time, which we're not doing, you would end up with systems that are inaccurate but helpful and advisory. And by the way, that may be okay for a while. Right, having a good doctor's advisor to advise the doctor might be good. Having a better system to advise you on where the traffic goes is not bad for you as the driver. I think the real question is, how far does this go? And this becomes a matter of speculation. The true believers, and I know many, believe that within the next decade, systems will emerge with far greater human-like capabilities for conception, for reasoning, for creativity. Those are the true believers. There are skeptics who believe that the computational requirements for that are so overwhelming with the current models that it either will never happen or it will require some new breakthrough that's going to occur in the next 5 to 10 years. It's not possible to know that. But I would say that the AI and ML has taken over my industry, and it's going to transform sort of every industry. At the moment, the best way to think of it is it's a really smart advisor, right? It helps you find the tank when you're looking at satellite images. It helps you figure out what flowers to buy. It helps farmers figure out what plants to plant, et cetera, et cetera.
So you also mentioned earlier that China is roughly 10 times ahead of the US in 5G. Why is that, and what lessons from that should we apply to AI and other critical technologies?
I'll give you the numbers that I know, and there may be newer numbers. China has 720,000 5G towers. They're adding 600,000 this year. The United States has about 50,000. That's a gap of at least an order of magnitude. The Chinese measured 5G network is 4.7 times faster than the measured network in the United States. So let's say 5 to 10 times ahead. It is a national priority that we have a powerful 5G network. We recommend, and I specifically recommend, that there be a 5G czar, a 5G, whatever the right term is, a group of people who figure out how to solve this problem. It needs money. It needs the telcos to be capable of building these things, not bankrupted by the auctions, which are incredibly expensive. The money that they're paying into those auctions needs to be recycled in some appropriate way, some legally correct way, into the infrastructure to accelerate it. Now, why am I so focused on 5G? Well, one, I'd like my phone to work better. I'm sure everybody on the call would. I'd really like a gigabit to my phone pretty much everywhere, at least in urban and suburban settings. Not an unreasonable objective. That's the objective in China, but it's much more than that. The 5G includes a series of facilities which are generally known as isochrony, which allow the communication that's very, very rapid between things. So 5G leadership is incredibly important for autonomy. And autonomy is a key component of national defense. I won't go into the details, but you can imagine why autonomy is really important for our national security. But there's another reason. which is that there will be a set of very powerful new apps that will be developed because of the speed, power, and nature of the 5G network. I'd like those apps to be built in the United States. There's a pretty high likelihood, if things don't change, that the key new applications will be built in China for their citizens and with their values, their approaches, their government in charge. Not a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a striking image, or striking idea. So we have time for one or maybe two more questions. So for one of them, how do you recommend the commercial sector encourage DoD collaboration of AI? So things like featured stores, data sets, and applications, rather than the siloed approach that you and many others have mentioned as being problematic.
So the question is about in general for the commercial sector?
How the commercial sector can encourage the DoD to be less siloed when it's developing the data sets and applications, and especially with regards to how funding constrains DoD's ability to work across silos.
The answer to a different question is on the commercial side. As part of this research network, we also would like to see large collections of open data available to everyone to do their training. That's key for the way they do it, and we talk about that. On the military side, the systems are so stovepiped that it requires a set of programs to get that information out. I won't go into the details, but there is an enterprise-wide project. I don't know how well it's discussed publicly within the DoD, headed by a 3-star Marine, who's really, really good guy. And they're actually trying to build a center that will actually get the data out of these systems into such a data platform. That's a good example of what's going to be needed. That data architecture, that or another approach, involves connectors, and the connectors take the data out of the siloed systems and put them in, I'll just summarize, as a generally large database. And I like those approaches. So the canonical way you think about AI and machine learning is first you have to get the data in one place so that you can rummage over it. And when you rummage over the data with your program, you discover insights that humans don't get. I want our national security and defense to have such systems because it'll make the humans who are doing SIGINT and all the other kinds of things that they're doing so much more powerful. And that's an easy win if we can make that happen.
Okay, and we have time for one last question. That's you mentioned infrastructure and connectivity, and that seems like it's closely related to increasing diversity of the talent pool that's working on artificial intelligence and sharing the benefits of technology. Can you explain a little bit about the importance of that?
Well, unfortunately, our AI community reflects the lack of diversity in our nation's scientific pipeline. And this is one of the great things about America is that, in particular, looking at women are far more empowered at the technical level than in many other countries. We need to advance that. The strength of our country is diversity and inclusion. So everything that we can do to reach those people, get them excited, empower them at a young age, give them status, make them feel good, hire them, pay them well, is critical to our national security. I think all of the programs that are underway are good. They're not good enough.
Okay. And with that, it seems that we're out of time, which is unfortunate because this conversation can go on for a while longer. Dr. Schmidt, thank you for your time and remarks today. And from here, we'll pivot to Kevin for the conference's final remarks.
And thank you, Justin, for everything you've done for us. And I want to thank the audience again. This is critical for our nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Dr. Schmidt. My name is Kevin McGinnis, and I'm Director for Research and Analysis on the National Security Commission on AI. Over the past year, I've had the pleasure of serving as the Commission's liaison to the NDIA Planning Committee for the National Security AI Conference and Expo. Before we close today's co-located conference, I'd like to take a few moments to thank the NDI team that has made this event possible. We are especially grateful to General Carlisle for his leadership, as well as Britt Sullivan, Tiffany Milner, Carissa Rosales, Abby Abdallah, Camilla Shanley, and many others from the NDI staff who have been the true heroes making this event successful. We are also deeply indebted to Shane Shaman, NDI Senior Fellow for AI, and someone I am fortunate to call a friend. Shane believed in the vision of an Expo from the outset and would stop at nothing to make it a reality. What have we learned over the past 3 days? As several speakers have mentioned, the Commission's final report describes the AI stack as requiring 4 parts: hardware, algorithms, software, and data. So I've collected a few data points to recap this groundbreaking event. The National Security AI Conference and Expo has featured speakers from more than 20 companies, bipartisan members of Congress, several universities and nonprofits, and 5 executive branch departments and agencies, including a variety of DoD components. The virtual platform has hosted more than 24 hours of content in the form of keynote addresses, company capability exhibitions, panel discussions, and more. And while I can't put a number on it, I have been thrilled to see so many connections forming virtually between participants over the past 3 days. When we first conceived of this event, we defined our purpose as building shared responsibility for US AI leadership and facilitating concrete partnerships between government, industry, academia, and civil society. Despite the challenges of our virtual environment, I believe we have achieved those goals and more. So what happens next? I have 2 specific requests. First, please lend your support to implementing the Commission's recommendations. Whether you work in industry, academia, the US government, or a private citizen, you have a role to play. I hope this event has made that role more tangible for each of you. Second, we have seen over the past several days how many amazing AI solutions already exist and how the US government might use them. Creating a comprehensive source for case studies and past AI projects that agencies can leverage would help us move from AI aspiration to AI action. I hope that industry and organizations such as NDIA will consider taking on this task. As we say in our final report, this is only the beginning of the beginning. We hope today is the start of new partnerships and new approaches to maintaining our nation's advantages in AI. Thank you again to NDIA, and thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us.